Right now, in 2026, there are roughly 24 million millionaires in America. That is not a rounding error. That is 1 in 13 households. And yet, if you walk into a room full of them and ask who actually feels financially secure, most hands stay down. That is not a punchline. That is a pattern I have watched repeat itself, quietly, for years. Here is what is happening. The tax bills that landed in April this year, the first filing season after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expired, looked different, noticeably different. Rates went back up. Brackets shifted. And for a lot of people sitting on what looked like serious money, the number on that tax form did not feel like a millionaire's problem. It felt personal. A family with $1,200,000 in net worth can still open a tax bill and feel their stomach drop. Not because they did something wrong, but because the math that made them a millionaire on paper does not automatically make them liquid, flexible, or protected. 80% of American millionaires are sitting on wealth they cannot easily touch. It is tied up in home equity, in retirement accounts with withdrawal penalties, in assets that look great on a spreadsheet and create real friction the moment life asks for cash. So here is the actual question. Not how much do you have, but how much of it is actually working for you. Because in 2026, having $1 million in a brokerage account is not the same as having $1 million in freedom. In some cases, it is closer to having a silent business partner named the IRS. One who did not sign up with you, does not share the risk, but absolutely shows up at distribution time. That gap between the number and the feeling is what this video is about. Let me start with John. John is 62. He lives in California. His net worth on paper is $1,200,000. And most mornings, he checks his accounts and feels something closer to anxiety than confidence. Here is why. $800,000 of that $1,200,000 is sitting in his house. He can see it. He cannot spend it. He cannot use it to cover a medical bill next month or replace the car that just crossed 180,000 miles. It exists as a number in an app tied to a property he still lives in a market he cannot fully predict. The remaining $400,000 is split between a 401k and a small brokerage account, which sounds like a lot until you actually run the math on what retirement costs in California in 2026. John is not unusual. John is the median. According to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the majority of American household wealth is concentrated in real estate and retirement accounts. Not cash, not liquid investments, property and locked up accounts. Which means when people say, "I'm a millionaire," what they often mean is I own an expensive house and I have been faithfully contributing to a 401k for 30 years. That is not a criticism. That is exactly what they were told to do. But here is the part nobody explained clearly. The definition of millionaire that most people are working toward was set roughly 30 years ago, in a different inflation environment with different tax rates, and before Medicare surcharges became a real line item in retirement planning. Feeling like you fell short is not a sign you spent too much or saved too poorly. The target moved, and most people were not told. Now zoom out for a second. Of all U.S. households, about 18% have a net worth above $1 million. That is the number you see in headlines. What those headlines rarely mention is the next cut. Only about 2.3% of households are what you could call liquid millionaires. People with $1 million or more in accessible, investable assets that are not locked inside a primary residence. That gap, from 18% down to 2.3%, tells you everything about how American wealth actually sits. Most of it is not available. Most of it is structural. And most retirement plans built around "I'll be a millionaire by the time I retire" did not account for the difference between net worth on a balance sheet and money you can actually deploy when you need it. John knows this intuitively. He feels it every time he gets a home repair estimate, every time the property tax bill arrives, every time he thinks about what the next 20 years of healthcare might cost. He has the number. He does not have the flexibility. And that brings up the part that most financial conversations skip entirely. Because the question is not just where your money is sitting. It is what happens when the IRS starts paying attention to the money that is actually liquid. I used to tell people that liquidity is king. Keep your money accessible. Stay flexible. Do not lock it up. I have to walk that back a little. Because looking at what the tax code looks like now, in 2026, unplanned liquidity is one of the more expensive mistakes a pre-retiree can make. Here is the mechanism. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expired at the end of 2025, the marginal rates that had been temporarily reduced went back up. That means pulling money out of a traditional 401k or IRA today costs more than it did 2 years ago. The withdrawal hits your ordinary income. Your ordinary income determines your tax bracket. And for a lot of people in their early 60s who are still earning, that bracket is already higher than they expect. But the tax rate is only half the story. There is a second system running quietly in the background, and most people do not find out about it until they get their Medicare bill. It is called IRMAA, Income-Related Monthly Adjustment Amount. The name is deliberately forgettable. The bill is not. Here is how it works. Medicare Part B and Part D premiums are not flat fees. They are income sensitive. If your modified adjusted gross income crosses certain thresholds, your monthly premium goes up in steps. In 2026, the base Part B premium is around $185 per month. Cross the first IRMAA threshold, which for a single filer sits at $106,000, and that number jumps significantly. Keep climbing, and it can reach over $600 per month, per person. Now think about what triggers that income. Capital gains from a brokerage account, dividends from a stock portfolio, required minimum distributions from a traditional IRA. All of it counts. All of it pushes your MA upward. And if you are sitting on a liquid million without a distribution strategy, the system will count every dollar you touch. Go back to John. John has $400,000 in liquid assets. He starts pulling from his brokerage account to cover living expenses. The capital gains and dividends from that account push his income over the IRMAA threshold. Now he is paying an extra $400 per month for Medicare. That is $4,800 per year. Over a 20-year retirement, that is $96,000 in surcharges before you factor in any adjustments for inflation or future threshold changes. Now look at someone like Mary. Mary has a similar net worth, but most of hers is in home equity. Her liquid income sits just under the IRMAA threshold. She pays the base Medicare premium. She does not trigger the surcharge. Same net worth, different structure, thousands of dollars per year in savings, just from where the money sits. That is not an accident. That is planning. The home equity does not get taxed when it appreciates. It does not generate dividends that push your MAJ up. It does not trigger IRMAA. And for people who built wealth the traditional American way, through property ownership over decades, that structure is actually working in their favor in ways the liquid portfolio is not. The trap is not having liquid assets. Liquid assets are genuinely useful. The trap is having liquid assets without a strategy for how and when they show up as income, because in the eyes of Medicare and the IRS, visible income is taxable income, and taxable income has a cost that compounds quietly over time. And that is just the tax side. The other half of this problem is what happens when you actually try to live off that money. Most people who have spent decades saving know the 4% rule. Take 4% of your portfolio each year, and statistically, your money should last 30 years. It became the default answer to the question, how much can I spend in retirement? It is not wrong. It is just incomplete in a way that matters a lot right now. A $1 million brokerage account at 4% gives you $40,000 per year. On paper, that works. In practice, it depends entirely on when you start drawing and what the market is doing when you do. If you retire in 2026 and the market drops 25% in your first 2 years, which is not a prediction, just a scenario that has happened before and will happen again, your portfolio is now worth $750,000 while you are still pulling $40,000 out. You are selling shares at the worst possible time to cover living expenses. The math that looked solid at $1 million starts unraveling fast at $750,000, and it does not recover at the same rate it fell. That is called sequence of returns risk. It is the reason $1 million in a brokerage account is not the same as $1 million in guaranteed income. Now run a different scenario. Someone with $500,000 in what I would call an optimized portfolio. Not larger, smarter in structure. They have built what planners sometimes call an income floor, a baseline of monthly income that does not depend on selling anything. Social Security timed strategically. A small annuity that covers fixed expenses. Dividend-generating assets that pay regardless of whether the market is up or down that quarter. That $500,000 optimized portfolio can generate $40,000 per year in relatively stable income without forcing a single share sale during a downturn. The person with $1 million in a standard brokerage account does not automatically have that stability. They have more money and more exposure to timing risk at the same time. This is the part that surprises people. Bigger is not always safer in retirement. Structure matters more than size once you stop accumulating and start distributing. The income floor concept is not complicated. It just rarely gets discussed until someone is already in retirement and starting to feel the anxiety of watching a balance drop. The idea is simple. Cover your non-negotiable monthly expenses, housing, food, insurance, utilities, with income sources that are not tied to market performance. Then use your investable assets for everything above that floor. When your floor is covered, a market downturn becomes an inconvenience instead of a crisis. You are not forced to sell. You can wait. That patience, that structural patience, is worth more than the difference between $500,000 and $1 million in a volatile year. If you are looking at a brokerage account with a solid balance and assuming the withdrawal math will work itself out, the stress test coming up next might change how you think about that. Let us run the actual numbers on what a healthcare shock looks like for someone in John's position. Fidelity's 2026 estimate for a couple retiring at 65 this year puts average healthcare costs at $165,000 over the course of retirement. That is just medical expenses. That number does not include long-term care. It does not include assisted living, home health aides, or memory care, which can run $5,000 to $8,000 per month depending on where you live. Most people hear that number and think, okay, that is a lot, but I have $1 million. And that logic holds until you look at what actually happens when you try to access that money under pressure. Here is the scenario. John is 68. The market has pulled back 20% over the past 14 months. His brokerage account, which started at $400,000, is now sitting at around $320,000. His wife needs a procedure. The out-of-pocket costs after Medicare are $35,000. He needs to sell shares to cover it. He sells at a loss. That triggers a capital loss, which sounds fine on the surface, but the remaining portfolio is smaller and more concentrated now. He is also still drawing for living expenses. His withdrawals, even reduced ones, are happening on a depleted base. And then the second hit lands. Because he pulled a significant amount from his accounts this year, his modified adjusted gross income spikes. He crosses the IRMAA threshold. His Medicare premiums for the following year go up. He is now paying more for the insurance that was supposed to protect him from exactly this kind of event. One medical event, 3 compounding consequences, lower portfolio value, forced selling at a discount, and higher insurance costs going forward. This is not a worst-case scenario. This is a moderate one. The liquid millionaire on paper has the assets, but the sequence matters. When you sell, how much you sell, and what that sale does to your taxable income in the same year. Those details determine whether your money lasts 20 years or 12. The version of this story that ends differently is not one where John has more money at the starting line. It is one where his income structure going into that medical event is different, where a portion of his fixed expenses are covered by sources that do not require selling anything, where the portfolio is insulated enough that a $35,000 withdrawal does not cascade into a tax event and an insurance penalty in the same calendar year. That restructuring is available. It does not require starting over, but it does require understanding why you feel financially uncomfortable even when the number looks right, and that discomfort has a name. There is a reason people with real assets still feel broke, and it is not laziness, and it is not bad math. It is the way the brain is wired to process loss. Behavioral economists call it loss aversion. Losing $10,000 feels roughly twice as painful as gaining $10,000 feels good. Which means when you are retired and watching a balance go from $400,000 to $380,000 to $361,000, your nervous system is not registering I am still fine. It is registering I am losing. Every withdrawal feels like a step towards zero, even when the math says you have decades of runway left. And layered underneath that is something quieter, a kind of lifestyle friction that does not have a clean name. You spent 30 years building the habit of not spending, living under your means, watching the number go up. That habit does not automatically switch off at 62 or 65. For a lot of people, it calcifies. They cannot bring themselves to spend comfortably even when they have earned the right to, because every dollar out feels like failure. The system taught you how to accumulate. Nobody handed you a clear framework for how to actually use what you built without feeling like you are doing something wrong. That discomfort is not a character flaw. It is a rational response to an irrational setup. You were shown a finish line. You crossed it. And now you are standing on the other side, realizing nobody explained what the race looks like from here. The shift that tends to help is a small one, but it reframes everything. Stop asking how much do I have? Start asking how much does my money earn me every month? Because $400,000 sitting in a balanced portfolio is not just a number. At a 5% yield, that is roughly $20,000 per year in income, about $1,667 per month. When you start seeing it as a monthly salary your assets are paying you, rather than a balance slowly being depleted, the emotional math changes. You are not spending down. You are collecting. That one reframe does not solve every problem, but it changes the relationship between you and the money you spent decades building. And it makes the structural decisions, the ones about income floors and tax thresholds and Medicare surcharges, feel less like sacrifice and more like design. None of what I just described is permanent. The structure can be adjusted, but it requires making a few specific moves before the tax and Medicare math locks in on you. Here is where to start. First, look up the IRMAA thresholds for 2026. For a single filer, the first surcharge kicks in at $106,000 in modified adjusted gross income. For married filing jointly, that number is $212,000. If your projected income for this year, including any planned withdrawals, dividends, or capital gains distributions, is sitting close to those lines, that is worth a serious conversation with a tax professional before December 31st, 2026. One unplanned distribution can push you into the next surcharge bracket and cost you thousands in Medicare premiums for the entire following year. The window to manage that is before the year closes, not after. Second, if you are 62 or older and you have significant equity sitting in your primary residence, there is a strategy worth understanding called equity harvesting. A reverse mortgage used correctly allows you to convert a portion of that home equity into a tax-free income stream without selling the property and without triggering a taxable event. It is not the right tool for everyone, and it comes with its own structure and costs that need to be evaluated carefully. But for someone sitting on $600,000 or $800,000 in home equity and feeling cash poor, it is a legitimate lever that most people never consider because the product has a reputation that does not always match the reality of how it works in a well-designed retirement plan. Third, look at your liquid assets and ask what percentage is actually generating income versus just sitting in growth-oriented positions. The goal of the income floor strategy is not to abandon growth. It is to make sure your non-negotiable monthly expenses, housing, insurance, food, utilities, are covered by sources that do not require selling anything. Dividends, a small annuity, Social Security timed correctly. My own family went through this restructuring earlier this year, adjusting our brokerage allocation ahead of the new tax brackets, and the process clarified things quickly. When you can see a monthly income number that covers your floor without touching principal, the rest of the portfolio starts to feel like what it actually is. Long-term capital, not survival money. These are not dramatic moves. They are structural ones. And the earlier you make them, the more options you have. Being a millionaire in 2026 is not about the seven-figure number anymore. It is about who controls the income that number generates. You or the IRS. The people who feel secure in retirement are not always the ones with the largest balance. They are the ones who built a structure where the money works on their terms, where withdrawals are planned, where Medicare surcharges are avoided by design, and where a bad market year does not force a bad financial decision. That is the game now. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe to Wes Investor. The strategies around protecting retirement assets are not static, and neither is the tax code. Staying current on how these systems interact is part of the work. Retirement is not a finish line, it is a system. And systems reward the people who understand how they actually operate.